Welcome into the deep dive. You know, Usually when we picture the beginning of the modern world, we think of um, grand, sweeping moments of triumph and discovery.
Right, the big heroic narrative.
Exactly. But if you rewind the clock just a few hundred years before all that, Europe was practically unrecognizable. I mean, we're talking about a continent that was completely isolated, just ravaged by disease, and trapped in this incredibly rigid social hierarchy.
It was a very dark place.
It really was. Yet somehow, from that incredibly dark place, society transformed so radically that it found itself on the absolute brink of global exploration. And that dramatic transformation is our mission today.
It's quite the journey.
It is. Now, before we jump in, let's establish our dynamic for today. For this deep dive, I'll be taking on the role of the student asking all the questions while you play the lecturer, explaining the material to me and our listener.
I love it. I am more than ready to step into that role. Because, the journey we're going on today is fascinating. When you look at the underlying mechanics of this shift, you realize it wasn't just like a single stroke of genius.
Right, it's never just one thing.
Exactly. It was this chaotic, compounding collision of a devastating plague, centuries of holy wars, and, believe it or not, an absolute obsession with foreign spices.
Spices, that's wild.
Yeah, that ultimately loaded the spring for Christopher Columbus to cross the Atlantic in 1492.
Okay, to ground us in the facts, we'll be pulling from section 1.2 of chapter 1 from U.S. history. So setting the baseline, the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 CE essentially kicked off the Middle Ages. But without Rome, what did the day-to-day reality of Europe actually look like for the average person?
Well, it was a landscape defined entirely by fear and fragmentation. I mean, when the Roman Empire collapsed, the centralized power, the standing armies, the legal systems, all of it just vanished.
It was just a total chaos.
Pretty much, Europe descended into this patchwork of political and military discord. You had marauding pillagers, Vikings from the north, Mongols from the east, Arab forces from the south, just constantly threatening the agrarian population.
So what do you even do if you're a farmer back then?
You do the only logical thing to survive. You retreat. People built massive walled cities like the heavily fortified Carcassonne in France and literally just hid behind double walls.
Okay, let's unpack this, because section 1.2 notes that about 60% of Western Europe's population were peasants, or serfs.
Right.
They needed protection from these invaders, so they submitted to powerful lords and their knights. But wait, so they traded essentially all their freedom and their physical labor just to hide behind a wall. It sounds almost like a medieval protection racket.
That is a very accurate way to put it, actually. The mechanics of it were entirely transactional, though obviously incredibly unequal. This system, feudalism, was like the ultimate survival compromise.
How did it work, exactly?
Well, the lords owned the land, right? The knights provided the military muscle to protect it, and the serfs provided the calories.
The physical labor.
Yeah. Technically, serfs were classified as free, but functionally, they were bound to the soil. Their physical labor had to generate enough food to feed their own families, the knights, the lord, and really everyone else trapped in that walled ecosystem.
Wow. And the reality of that life was just viscerally brutal. We're talking about a time when a person's entire known universe was like a 10-mile radius from the exact spot they were born.
Oh, absolutely. Escaping that 10-mile radius was nearly impossible. And surviving within it was just as hard. I mean, without sanitation, clean water, or even a basic understanding of germ theory, common infections were a death sentence.
Just a completely different reality.
Completely. Life expectancy hovered under 45 years. The mortality rates were staggering. Women routinely died in childbirth, and roughly 1/3 of all children never lived to see their 5th birthday.
God, that is so bleak. I want you, the listener, to really picture yourself in this era. Imagine entire families, including grandparents, crammed into these cold, dirty, one-room hovels.
Just piled in together.
Right. You'd have a constant fire burning inside for warmth and cooking, which, by the way, was always threatening to ignite the thatched roof. And the ventilation was so poor that the constant smoke actually damaged people's eyesight over time.
Yeah, the smoke was inescapable.
And imagine owning maybe 2 sets of clothes. You have a woolen jacket and linen undergarments, and you only bathe in the spring when the frozen rivers actually melt. Your entire existence was just dictated by the seasons and basic survival.
Because idleness meant starvation. In the early spring, survival meant tilling the soil with heavy wooden plows to plant wheat, rye, and barley. Then summer brought the exhaustion of shearing sheep and harvesting hay.
It's just nonstop physical labor.
Exactly. Fall was this intense race to butcher livestock and smoke the meat before it rotted, and then winter drove everyone back into those smoky hovels to weave yarn and thresh vein. A single drought, a bad frost, or a swarm of locusts could wipe out a village's entire food supply.
It's staggering to think about that level of vulnerability. Yet, amidst all this fragmentation, there was one institution that survived the fall of Rome and actually managed to centralize power, which was the Christian Church.
Right. The church was really the sole unifying international organization left in Western Europe. Following the Great Schism in 1054, the church formally split.
Okay, split how?
Well, the eastern branch adopted Greek and centered itself in Constantinople, but the western branch remained in Rome, used Latin, and evolved into the Roman Catholic Church, led by the Pope. It quickly built up this massive, borderless bureaucracy of cardinals, archbishops, bishops, and local priests.
But wait, how did a distant bureaucracy in Rome maintain such total control over isolated, illiterate serfs living hundreds of miles away?
By holding an absolute monopoly on information and salvation, like you said, serfs were universally illiterate, and the church operated entirely in Latin. So a peasant couldn't just read the Bible to understand God's word for themselves.
So they needed the priest.
Exactly. They were completely dependent on the parish priest to translate and interpret the entire universe for them. Sickness wasn't seen as a pathogen. It was a punishment for sin. A failed crop meant the village hadn't prayed hard enough.
Wow, that is a lot of psychological control.
It was. And on a mechanical level, the church collected a tithe, a 10% tax. In a society without a functional currency, you don't write a check. You hand over a tenth of your wheat harvest, your eggs, your pigs. The church essentially hoarded the physical wealth of survival.
That's a huge economic drain on people who already have nothing.
Yeah. Add in the terrifying threat of excommunication, which meant eternal damnation in hell. And even kings bowed to the Pope.
And right at the peak of this deeply entrenched, highly controlled feudal society, the absolute unthinkable happens in the 1340s. Genoese merchants returning from the Black Sea unwittingly trigger the bubonic plague.
The Black Death. It was terrifyingly efficient because it attacked through two vectors. You had a rat-borne strain targeting the lymph nodes and an airborne pneumonic strain targeting the lungs.
So it was just spreading everywhere in every way possible.
Yes, the speed of the transmission was unprecedented. In just a few years, the plague wiped out roughly 1/3 of the entire European population. Millions perished. Entire lineages and villages vanished from the map, leaving these eerie ghost towns in their wake.
Now here's where it gets really interesting, because looking at section 1.2, it seems totally counterintuitive. The textbook actually frames this catastrophic mass casualty event as the very thing that rejuvenated society by the year 1450. I mean, how does a plague wiping out millions actually rejuvenate society?
It comes down to morbid math, honestly. The plague didn't destroy land, tools, or infrastructure. It only destroyed people. Suddenly, the ratio of physical resources to human labor completely flipped.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, for the first time in centuries, there was a severe labor shortage. A peasant could look at a lord and demand better living conditions or a share of the harvest, because if the lord refused, the peasant could just walk down the road to the next empty estate that desperately needed a plowman.
So they suddenly had leverage.
Exactly. This leverage broke the rigid chains of feudalism. Fewer people meant a higher birth rate among the survivors, and coupled with bountiful harvests, they had vastly more food and wealth per capita. By 1450, you have this better-fed, upwardly mobile society primed to finally look beyond its own walls.
So Europe is finally recovering and starting to look outward. But while Europe was locked in those dark ages, the East had undergone a massive transformation of its own. And that brings us to the year 622 CE.
Right. In 622, near Mecca in modern-day Saudi Arabia, a prophet named Muhammad received a revelation that formed the foundation of Islam. His message, codified in the Quran, was strictly monotheistic. It acknowledged figures like Abraham, Moses, and Christ, but strictly as prophets alongside Muhammad.
And spread pretty quickly, right?
Astonishingly quickly. Following his death in 632, Islam expanded with incredible velocity through both conversion and military conquest. It swept across the Middle East, blanketed North Africa, and by 711 CE, Muslim forces had crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and established a massive presence in Spain. They brought major centers of learning and trade, like Cordoba.
But Europe's Christian kingdoms obviously saw this as a direct threat. The historical record, as presented in the textbook, outlines a series of intense, centuries-long religious wars. We see the Reconquista slowly pushing Muslim forces out of Spain, And then in 1095, the launch of the Crusades to retake Jerusalem.
The Crusades were driven by this potent mix of religious zeal, the Pope's promise of absolute forgiveness for sins, and, the prospect of claiming foreign land. And we should note the warfare was profoundly violent.
Yeah, the textbook details are pretty graphic.
Very. When predominantly French knights breached the walls of Jerusalem in June 1099, the slaughter was indiscriminate. A French eyewitness actually documented that inside Solomon's temple, roughly 10,000 people were beheaded. He described blood pooling up to the attackers' ankles.
That is just horrifying.
It is. And Muslim chroniclers corroborated the horrific looting of private homes and the stripping of the city's wealth. Control of the Holy Lands bounced back and forth. Muslim forces under the legendary Saladin retook Jerusalem in 1187, triggering another massive crusade.
Led by England's King Richard the Lionheart, right.
Exactly. The bloodshed didn't formally end until the Crusaders lost their final stronghold at Acre in 1291. And Section 1.2 highlights the deeply toxic cultural hangover of these wars. There was wide-scale persecution of Jewish populations who were falsely labeled killers of Christ and heavily taxed or expelled. Plus, it forged a permanently entrenched hatred between Muslims and Christians.
So what does this all mean for Europe's future? Besides the geopolitical trauma?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the unintended consequence of all that violence was the birth of a global appetite, trade. When those crusaders marched into the Middle East, they experienced a standard of living they couldn't have fathomed back in their cold, smoky hovels.
They saw how the other half lived.
Exactly. They felt woven silk, they learned the utility of hard porcelain,
Yeah.
and most importantly, they tasted spices that could preserve meat and mask the flavor of decay. When they marched back to Europe, they brought those cravings with them. They created this explosive, inelastic demand for exotic goods.
And coastal cities like Venice jumped on this immediately, right? They got incredibly wealthy, monopolizing trade with Islamic merchants in the Mediterranean, basically funneling goods from the ancient Silk Road into Europe. But how did that Silk Road bottleneck actually function? Why was it so inefficient?
Moving physical cargo thousands of miles over land is just a logistical nightmare. A sack of pepper from Indonesia had to change hands dozens of times before it reached a Venetian dock. Every time it changed hands, a middleman took a cut.
That makes sense.
Plus, Muslim empires controlled the major land routes and levied heavy taxes on the caravans. And the land routes were intensely dangerous. Bandits routinely ambushed merchants. By the time those spices reached the markets of Genoa or Florence, the markup was astronomical.
So they needed a workaround.
Desperately, Europe realized that if they wanted the immense wealth of the East, they had to bypass the land routes and the Venetian monopoly entirely. They needed a direct water route.
Which sparks the great maritime race for the East. And the nation that takes the early lead isn't some massive powerhouse like Spain or England. It's Portugal.
Yeah, Portugal had a unique geographic advantage, sitting on the extreme western edge of the Iberian Peninsula, just staring out at the Atlantic. But the real catalyst was their ruler, Prince Henry the Navigator. He poured state resources into exploration down the western coast of Africa.
And they had better ships, didn't they?
They did. The breakthrough wasn't just bravery, it was technology. Portuguese shipbuilders adopted the caravel, which was a lighter, much more maneuverable ship.
And the crucial innovation there was the sail, right?
The lateen, or triangular sail, it changed everything. Traditional square sails act like parachutes, so they only catch the wind pushing from behind. If the wind blows against you, you're stuck. But by rigging triangular sails, a ship acts more like an airplane wing, generating lift.
Oh, wow, so they could steer into the wind.
Exactly. It allows sailors to tack, or zigzag, forward into a headwind. Suddenly, sailors were no longer prisoners to the weather patterns. They could navigate the open ocean and push further down the African coast to undercut Venice.
Meanwhile, right next door, Spain is undergoing this radical and brutal consolidation of power. In 1469, King Ferdinand of Aragon marries Queen Isabella of Castile, uniting these two powerful independent kingdoms.
And their unification laid the foundation for modern Spain, which they enforced with an iron fist. Isabella, driven by extreme religious fervor, was instrumental in launching the Spanish Inquisition in 1480.
The Inquisition, just brutal.
Absolutely ruthless. It was a campaign designed to root out heresy, specifically targeting Jewish and Muslim citizens who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of secretly maintaining their original faiths. By the pivotal year of 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella accomplished two massive objectives.
Were they?
Well, they conquered Granada, ending the nearly 800-year Reconquista, and they ordered the absolute expulsion of all unconverted Jews and Muslims from Spain.
So we arrive at 1492. Spain is unified, religious minorities are expelled, and the monarchs are absolutely desperate to beat Portugal in the trade race. Enter Christopher Columbus. Now here is what always confuses me. We are all taught in grade school that Columbus was this rogue genius who sailed west to prove the earth was round. But looking at the textbook, that's a total myth, right?
It is a total myth. The idea that Columbus was fighting against a society of flat earthers is a complete fabrication. Educated people in 1492 knew the globe was a sphere. The Greek mathematician Eratosthenes accurately calculated the Earth's circumference way back in the 2nd century BCE.
Wait, really? The Greeks knew the size of the earth?
Yeah. The debate wasn't about the shape of the Earth, it was entirely about the size. Columbus essentially looked at Eratosthenes' math and just rejected it. He grossly underestimated the circumference of the globe, believing the ocean separating Europe from Asia was relatively small. He was pitching a shortcut.
So what actually drove Columbus then? If his entire foundational premise was based on terrible math, why do this?
The textbook distills it down to God, glory, and gold. Isabella wanted to spread Christianity across the globe. Ferdinand wanted the immense tax revenues from a direct spice trade. But Columbus himself, he was completely obsessed with a very specific book, Marco Polo's Travels.
Marco Polo, the explorer.
Yes, Polo's account of his 1271 journey to the court of Kublai Khan was like the ultimate medieval bestseller. It described a world of unfathomable opulence. Polo wrote of Chinese imperial palaces with roofs completely tiled in gold and silver, shining like crystal in the sun.
Roofs made of gold.
Yeah, and dining halls large enough to seat 6,000 nobles. For an ambitious, glory-hungry sailor like Columbus, reading those descriptions was like staring at a winning lottery ticket. The allure of that exotic wealth was the ultimate psychological catalyst.
So in August 1492, armed with funding from the Spanish crown, which took him 6 years to get, by the way, a copy of Marco Polo's book and wildly inaccurate geographical math, Columbus set sail. And his ships were tiny.
So small.
He leaves with 3 caravels, and the flagship, the Santa Maria, was a mere 58 feet long. I mean, imagine crossing an uncharted ocean in a boat the size of a modern city bus.
It's terrifying.
But 6 weeks and 3,000 miles later, they make landfall in the Bahamas on an island the native Lucayans called Guanahani. Columbus planted a flag and renamed it San Salvador.
And that moment of landfall fundamentally severed the timeline of human history. It permanently bridged the Atlantic, ushering in an era of relentless exploration, exploitation, and permanent contact with the Americas. It was really the culmination of European powers evolving from these terrified, isolated communities hiding behind stone walls into aggressive, expansionist empires.
It is just an incredible narrative arc. To think that a society where an individual rarely traveled 10 miles from their cold, smoky hovel was eventually propelled across a completely unknown ocean. And they didn't do it because of one brilliant strategic meeting.
No, not at all.
They were pushed by a compounding collision of intense religious zeal, the massive economic vacuum left by the bubonic plague, the aerodynamic physics of a triangular sail, and an absolute craving for the spices and silks of the East.
It's a perfect case study in how massive societal shifts operate. History doesn't just pivot on a single event in a vacuum. True transformation happens when an existential crisis, a technological leap, and human desire all intersect at the exact same moment. I mean, the blockage of the traditional land-based Silk Road essentially forced humanity to innovate and master the oceans just to get what they wanted.
Which leaves you with a really fascinating thought to carry with you. In the 15th century, the barrier to extreme wealth and progress was a dangerous, heavily taxed land route, which forced humanity to master the oceans. Looking at our world today, with our insatiable demand for things like rare earth metals, endless energy, and data, what's the Silk Road of our era, and what unknown oceans will it force us to cross next?
That is an incredible question to end on.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, and we'll see you next time.